The freezing wind of early October Montana sliced through the cracks of the old Jeep Cherokee as we sped past the last gas station on the outskirts of Bozeman. I sat motionless, curled against the window, my legs tucked under me, bracing for something I couldn't name yet, but I knew it was coming. The sky above the endless pine trees had started bleeding into an eerie mix of grays and purples, an omen of the night ahead. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice barely louder than a whisper. My mother gripped the wheel tighter, her knuckles turning bone white. "It's a surprise," she said flatly without looking at me. I swallowed hard. Those words had never meant anything good. My name is Sienna Harper, and that was the last time I would ever sit in that car. The air grew heavier as the trees thickened, swallowing the narrow road hole. The familiar hum of the radio had vanished miles back, and my phone had long since lost signal. My mother's face, cold and sharp like the mountains that loomed in the distance, gave nothing away. I watched her from the corner of my eye, her jaw clenched, breathing shallow, as if she was wrestling with something unspeakable. My pulse began to race, a warning my body registered before my brain caught up. Without warning, the car jerked violently onto a dirt path barely visible between two twisted rows of lodgepole pines. Gravel crunched under the tires as the vehicle came to a screeching stop. My breath caught, my mother flung her door open and stormed around to my side before I could even unbuckle my seatbelt. The door yanked open. Cold air and panic hit me at the same time. "Out," she commanded. "What?" I stammered, confusion swirling into dread. I reached to steady myself on the door frame, my legs weak as always, trembling under the weight of my own body. Pain shot up my side as my right foot twisted awkwardly beneath me. I gasped, but she showed no mercy. She tossed a small duffel bag onto the frosted dirt at my feet. "I'll come back when you're ready to stop making everything about you," she hissed through clenched teeth. I stared up at her, heart thudding painfully against my rib cage. "You can't leave me here! Please!" The words barely left my lips before her footsteps were already crunching back to the driver's side. I pushed against the cold ground with trembling arms, dragging myself upright as best I could. "Mom!" I cried out one last time. The engine revved violently. Red brake lights flickered through the trees like distant flares in a sea of darkness, and then disappeared. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was deafening, suffocating, almost alive. I sat there, stunned, the cold seeping into my bones. No phone, no wheelchair, no way to stand. Just me, a worn duffel bag, and the dark, endless woods. I pressed my back against the nearest tree, gasping in ragged breaths. I should have panicked, but I didn't. Some twisted part of me had always known this moment would come. My mother hadn't just abandoned me physically. She had been erasing me for years. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying with it the sharp scent of pine and decaying leaves. I reached into my coat pocket instinctively. My fingers brushed against soft green fabric, a damask handkerchief, the last thing my grandmother had given me before she passed. I clutched it tightly, as if it could somehow anchor me to something, anything. As dusk melted into night, I realized I couldn't stay in that spot. I scanned the trees frantically. They're barely visible ahead through the underbrush, the dark silhouette of an old wooden deer stand. I dragged myself toward it inch by agonizing inch, my palms scraped raw by twigs and bark, my legs burning with every movement. My breath came in short, sharp gasps that turned to mist in the cold air. I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. By the time I reached the weathered base of the structure, I collapsed under it. I curled my aching body into the smallest ball I could, zipped my jacket tight, and shoved the duffel bag under my head as a pillow. The forest loomed above me like a cathedral of silent witnesses. "Please, don't let me die out here," I whispered into the blackness, but only the wind answered. I squeezed the handkerchief tighter as the first stars bled into the night sky. I didn't know it then, but I wasn't truly alone. Someone was already watching, and everything was about to change. I must have dozed off for a while beneath the deer stand, lulled into a shallow, restless sleep by the cruel exhaustion of fear and cold. When I opened my eyes again, the last sliver of daylight had bled away completely, and I was swallowed whole by a sky so dark it felt like it might crush me. Then I heard it. Snap! A single twig cracked somewhere in the darkness behind me. I froze, heart hammering, so violently I thought it might give me away. I held my breath, straining to hear through the roaring in my ears. Was it an animal? The wind? Or worse, someone watching? Another sound followed, softer this time. The unmistakable weight of footsteps pressing into damp forest floor. Slow, deliberate human. Panic surged through me. I twisted awkwardly toward the sound, pain screaming up my side as I shifted my useless legs beneath me. My hands were numb, but I used my elbows, dragging myself just far enough to see. Boots. Not hiking boots or sneakers. Worn leather, heavy-soled, the edges caked in dried mud. They stood motionless at the edge of the clearing, just out of reach of the weak moonlight, silent, waiting. Hello. My voice cracked, barely louder than the wind. Please help me. The figure didn't answer. But then, finally, they stepped forward slowly, the boots crunching over dead leaves. The silhouette of a tall, broad-shouldered man emerged from the shadows. A dark hood covered most of his face. I recoiled instinctively, fear turning my breath sharp and shallow. He crouched beside me without a word, unzipped a battered canvas backpack, and pulled out a half-empty bottle of water. He held it out. I hesitated only a second before snatching it with shaking hands and gulping it down desperately. The stranger then draped a thick, worn flannel coat over my shoulders. I flinched at the touch at first, but the warmth burrowed instantly into my frozen skin like salvation. Who are you? I rasped. Are you a hunter? What are you doing out here? He didn't answer. His face remained hidden beneath the shadows of his hood. Without looking up, he began to gather fallen branches into a small pile and struck flint against stone. Tiny sparks danced briefly before flame took hold. Soft orange light flickering across the sharp lines of his strong, calloused hands. I stared, bewildered. His movements were precise, practiced, like he had done this hundreds of times before. Once the fire crackled between us, he handed me a granola bar. I barely registered how the wrapper had been slightly torn as I ripped it open and devoured it. Hunger drowned out any instinct for caution. The man sat back on his heels, silent, simply watching the flames dance. I studied him cautiously, searching for any clue of his intentions, but he offered none. There was something about him, though, something eerily familiar. A presence I couldn't place. I thought back hazily to years ago, a quiet boy who used to volunteer in my high school library, the one who never laughed when I confessed I loved drawing trees. Could it be? No, that was impossible. Or was it? I opened my mouth to ask again, but before I could speak, he stood up without a sound, pulled his hood tighter around his face, and disappeared back into the trees as silently as he had come. I stared after him, stunned. Wait, I whispered hoarsely into the dark, but he never looked back. The forest closed around me once more, leaving only the crackle of the tiny fire as my companion. For the first time, the woods felt a fraction less terrifying. Not safe, not yet, but less like a death sentence. Someone had seen me, had helped me, and though I didn't understand why, it was enough to keep me from sinking into hopelessness. Miles away, back in our perfect suburban home with its polished wood floors and overpriced candles, my mother, Eleanor Harper, poured herself a glass of Pinot Noir and leaned casually against the kitchen island. My sister, Aubrey, fresh from the salon, scrolled her phone absently. "Where's Sienna?" Aubrey asked without glancing up. My mother sipped her wine and replied smoothly. She ran off again. "You know how she gets." Her voice didn't waver. It was the same tone she used when ordering takeout or confirming a spa appointment. Cold, detached, like she hadn't just abandoned her disabled daughter to freeze alone in the woods. Aubrey groaned dramatically. Of course she did. She ruins everything. And just like that, I ceased to exist. My erasure folded neatly into their story, like I had never been real at all. I pulled the borrowed flannel tighter around my shaking body as the fire slowly burned itself into a soft ring of glowing embers. My limbs ached from the cold and the brutal, unforgiving ground. But the worst pain came from deeper inside. My mother hadn't just left me behind. She had erased me. She had done it before in smaller ways. She had turned my cries into accusations, my needs into burdens, my existence into inconvenience. But this was final, a living obituary. I stared into the dying flames, thinking about the version of me she would tell the world. Unstable, dramatic, impossible to live with, the difficult daughter. That label had followed me for years, branded me until I stopped protesting, because protest only made it worse. The first birds stirred above, their sharp whistles piercing the frozen dawn. I barely moved, numb and exhausted under the flannel coat left by the stranger. My ankle throbbed with each tiny shift of weight, the swelling worsening in the biting cold. The man hadn't come back. Part of me wondered if he had ever really been there at all. Just another fragile hallucination of a mind pushed too far. Hunger gnawed at me again, sharp and cruel, but I forced myself upright with sheer will. My hands dug into the frozen earth to brace me as I pushed off weakly from the ground. My body screamed in protest. That's when my mind drifted backward to the last family dinner I was forced to attend. I had been 17. The night had felt wrong from the moment I walked through the front door, the tension in the air thick enough to choke on. My mother had prepared her signature roast chicken, burning it slightly as usual. After dessert, she stood up dramatically in the living room, waving her leather purse in one hand like it was evidence at trial. $600 is missing. The room froze. I blinked, confused. She zeroed in on me like a hawk spotting wounded prey. Sienna, did you take it? My voice trembled. No, her laugh was cold, sharp, surgical. That's funny. No one else had a reason to. You've been behind on your bills, haven't you? I swallowed the lump in my throat, feeling every gaze in the room shift toward me. No, I didn't take it. Then who? She demanded, spinning slowly like an actress searching for the camera. It always ends up being you, doesn't it? I had wanted someone, anyone, to stand up for me. My cousin Miles sat quietly, staring down at his shoes. Even Natalie, my sweet younger cousin, stared at her phone, refusing to meet my eyes. Later that night, after the storm had passed and I'd retreated to my room, I saw her, Aubrey, slipping a thick envelope into her expensive leather tote. Our eyes locked. She didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. She smiled, smug and untouchable, and walked out of the house without a word. I had said nothing because it wouldn't have mattered. They needed a scapegoat, and I had been perfectly shaped to fit the role. The imperfect daughter allowed them to keep their reflections clean. Months later, after a brutal physical therapy session, I had come home to find my most private sanctuary violated. My journal, filled with sketches and scribbled thoughts no one was ever meant to see, lay open on the kitchen table. Aubrey stood over it, reading aloud in an exaggerated voice, dripping with mockery. Sometimes I feel like I'm screaming into a void and no one in this house hears me, they laughed. My Uncle Dennis chuckled cruelly. Sienna the poet. So dramatic. I had frozen in place, horrified. I'd poured my soul into those pages, and they'd weaponized it against me. Aubrey flipped another page with theatrical flair. I just want my mom to see me too, she read in a sing-song tone. I had snatched the journal from her hands, shaking with rage and humiliation. But the damage had been done. That was the night I stopped writing. The night I learned even my most private words weren't safe in that house. Now, Crouched in dirt and ashes beneath the deer stand, I felt that old weight press down again. The echo of their laughter bruised me deeper than any punch ever could. I rubbed the heel of my hand against my forehead and whispered hoarsely into the silent trees. I didn't run away. I was discarded. The wind answered me by stirring the dead leaves across the ground. Then something caught my eye, a folded scrap of paper, tucked between the exposed roots of an oak tree like it had been carefully placed, not dropped. My hands shook violently as I reached out and unfolded it. It was my handwriting, a page torn from the very journal they had ridiculed. But this page had never left my room. Someone had found it, someone had brought it here. The sketch was one I had drawn at 15, a weeping willow leaning over a small creek, its branches drooping like arms too tired to keep holding on. But across the back, in a handwriting that was not mine, 6 words had been scrawled. You deserved better. Keep walking. I stared at the note, my heart pounding so loudly it muffled the distant whispers of wind through pine branches. The edges of the paper were crisp, unwrinkled, as if someone had taken great care to preserve it. A strange, sharp mix of dread and wonder twisted inside me. Someone had been reading my words, someone who shouldn't have had access, unless they had been close. The fire had burned down to soft ash, but I couldn't pull my gaze from the page in my hand. It wasn't just any sketch. It was from the night I had hidden in my room, tears streaking my face after my mother had screamed at me for crying during a thunderstorm. I hadn't fought back. I had drawn instead. And now here it was. Saved. Delivered. Found. My fingers traced the unfamiliar handwriting. You deserved better. Keep walking. I wasn't sure if I was shaking from cold or the realization that I might not be entirely alone in this cruel wilderness. Clutching the fragile paper tightly, I struggled to stand. Pain flared sharply through my ankle as I leaned heavily on a nearby fallen branch, transforming it into a makeshift cane. Every step felt like penance, not for what I had done, but for what they claimed I had. I limped forward slowly, wincing as my foot protested. The forest opened slightly ahead, and something unusual caught my eye. Tiny flecks of paper dusting the underbrush, like ashes drifting from some long-dead fire. I followed them. Some were scorched, curling at the edges like wounded petals. Others had been torn violently, shredded in frustration. But a few were untouched whole. My name was faintly visible in places. I recognized doodles, flowers I had always sketched in the margins, pieces of myself scattered like breadcrumbs. Then I froze. Ahead, nestled against the base of a mossy tree stump, lay a folded page that made my breath hitch painfully. It wasn't burned. It wasn't torn. It was intact. And I knew instantly what it was. A letter. Not just any letter. My own letter. I knelt slowly, my knees sinking into the damp earth, and picked it up with trembling fingers. The faded ink stared back at me from paper yellowed by time. My uneven middle school handwriting declared, "You are not invisible. You matter, even if no one says it." I sank onto the cold ground, gripping the page to my chest as hot tears slipped silently down my cheeks. I remembered writing it at 12, sitting cross-legged in my childhood bedroom under the dim glow of my bedside lamp. I had folded it tightly and hidden it between 2 loose floorboards in my closet, a desperate promise to my future self that things would get better someday. No one knew about that letter. No one. Who had found it? Who had brought it here now? I sat there for what felt like hours, whispering the words over and over like a mantra into the icy air. I am not invisible. Finally, I forced myself up again. The pain in my ankle was merciless, but I pressed forward, driven by something far stronger than survival instinct. A narrow path revealed itself ahead, winding through the towering trees, partly obscured by fallen leaves and broken twigs. Something deep inside told me to follow, and so I did. I limped along the trail, every step a brutal reminder of my fractured body, my fractured past. About a quarter mile in, The dense woods gave way to a small clearing where an ancient, crumbling structure stood silently under the weight of time, an abandoned ranger station. The roof sagged under tangled vines. The windows were fogged and cracked. The door hung at an awkward angle on rusted hinges. I hesitated only briefly before stepping inside. The air smelled of mildew, pine, and dust. Against the far wall sat an old wooden crate, and on top of it my breath caught an ancient laptop. The casing was scratched and dented, patched with duct tape. A thin cord ran from the device to a small solar charger, propped up awkwardly near the broken window. I stared in disbelief. The laptop was on. The screen glowed faintly in the gloom, open to a blog dashboard. My name was typed into the search bar. Dozens of posts filled the feed. Anonymous entries dated months, even years back, each one heartbreakingly familiar. She was never weak. They just needed her to be. They called her dramatic when she told the truth. I scrolled frantically, trembling. Each post documented moments only I had written down in the safety of my stolen journals. Words I had never spoken aloud. Someone had been reading, recording, protecting me in silence. At the bottom of one entry, a simple promise stared back at me. If no one listens to her story, I will. I'll remember every page they tried to burn. The air shifted suddenly. I turned toward the jagged hole where the window glass had long since vanished. Boot prints, fresh and deep, leading away toward the stream that wound through the forest. They weren't mine. I stepped out cautiously into the clearing, heart hammering violently against my ribs. On the far edge of the trees, a figure moved, watching, waiting. But for the first time, I didn't feel fear. I didn't run. I didn't freeze. I took a single step forward, then another, toward the one person who had seen me when no one else did. Not the broken daughter, not the burden, me. I gripped my old letter tightly, whispering one last time into the bitter Montana air. I am not invisible anymore. I stumbled after the disappearing figure, my legs trembling with each uneven step. The narrow path wove between towering pines, the ground soft beneath layers of wet needles. The branches above stretched like skeletal arms across the gray Montana sky, filtering thin rays of afternoon light. Every step burned. My ankle screamed in protest, yet the pain grounded me. It reminded me I was alive. The forest thinned slowly, giving way to a cracked ribbon of forgotten asphalt, peppered with moss and stray pine cones. Civilization. I half-limped, half-dragged myself along the deserted road, heart pounding with a desperate mixture of hope and terror. A mailbox appeared first, then a weathered fence, then at last the flickering neon sign of a lonely gas station. Across the street, glowing warmly against the dull cold of the late day, stood a diner. The windows fogged from the heat inside. Laughter drifted faintly onto the empty sidewalk. Silverware clinking against ceramic plates, the soft murmur of conversation. I froze. There, seated comfortably at a booth by the window, a glass of red wine in her manicured hand, sat my mother. Her golden hair was perfectly curled, her posture flawless, just as it had always been for PDA meetings, gallery openings, court appearances. Next to her sat my stepfather, chuckling over a shared joke with my brother and Aubrey. Aubrey's laugh echoed through the glass, carefree and bright as she flipped her hair back over one shoulder. They were sharing fries, smiling, relaxed, unbothered. My breath caught painfully. My chest tightened so violently I thought my ribs might snap. They hadn't called me. They hadn't searched. They hadn't reported me missing. They had intended for me to disappear. I stood frozen, trembling on the sidewalk, watching them enjoy their meal as if I never existed, like I had simply been edited out of their lives, a problem solved. My knees almost gave out, and then movement. Across the table, my cousin Natalie shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her posture was tense, her shoulders drawn up tightly as if she were bracing for something. Slowly, hesitantly, she turned her head toward the window. Her eyes locked with mine. Everything else faded. The voices, the clinking silverware, the cold biting into my skin, all vanished. Her lips parted, trembling, and she mouthed the words so clearly I didn't even need sound to understand. "I'm sorry." Twice. The impact nearly brought me to my knees. Suddenly, I remembered weeks earlier, Natalie lingering awkwardly by the kitchen door while my mother and Aubrey whispered heatedly. I remembered the way she had paused, how she had looked over her shoulder at me with unspoken worry before slipping out of sight. She had known something was wrong. She may not have known how far they would go, but she had heard enough, and she had said nothing. I inhaled sharply, forcing my legs to move. I turned away from the diner before my knees collapsed. I didn't cry. I couldn't. I was too dried out even for tears. I walked past the diner, past the gas station, past the last blinking sign at the edge of town. The streetlights flickered to life, bathing the empty road in pale yellow halos. I kept walking, block after block, until I came across a rundown bus shelter with one broken bench and an overflowing trash can. I sank onto the splintered wood and let my back slump against the cold glass wall. The sky had shifted into deep purple, the first stars peeking shyly through the cloud breaks. I stared upward, hollow and weightless. "Maybe they're right," I whispered bitterly. "Maybe I should disappear. Let them rewrite the ending however they want." But I didn't move. I stayed there as the hours slipped by, letting the numbness swallow me whole. And then the smallest touch. Something brushed gently against my shoulder. I opened my eyes slowly. A bus driver stood beside me, late 50s, heavy-set, with wire-rimmed glasses and kind, tired eyes. His uniform was faded and stretched at the elbows. Without asking a single question, he draped a wool blanket over my shivering form and tucked it beneath my chin. "You okay, honey?" he asked softly. I couldn't speak. I could only nod faintly as warmth spread through my skin. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't love. But it was kindness. I wasn't gone yet. The driver gave me a small, understanding smile before turning away and climbing back onto his bus. The blanket's weight grounded me. I stared at my hands, pale and raw against the coarse wool. For the first time in what felt like forever, I remembered what warmth felt like. I sat that way until dawn teased soft streaks of silver through the glass walls of the station. I could have stayed there forever, frozen between past and present. But something inside me stirred faintly, flickering, refusing to go out. I tightened my grip on the letter I had carried from the woods. The words still burned against my palm. "You are not invisible." I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The early morning air nipped at my cheeks as I stood up from the worn bench, the blanket trailing behind me like the shredded remains of some old life. I shuffled stiffly down the block, legs aching, mind blank. My destination didn't matter. I only knew I had to move, to keep walking. A few streets over, a squat brick building came into view, its paint peeling in large flakes. Above the dented metal door hung a faded wooden sign, Montana Women's Shelter. The inside smelled of oatmeal and bleach. A middle-aged woman behind the desk smiled warmly. She slid a steaming bowl of oatmeal and a plastic cup of orange juice across the counter. "You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to," she said gently. I gave my name as Anna. I wasn't ready for Sienna, not yet. I ate in silence, showered, wrapped my still tender ankle in gauze. They offered to contact anyone for me. I shook my head. There was no one. Later that morning, wearing donated jeans and a second-hand flannel, I walked the unfamiliar streets of downtown Bozeman. Autumn had arrived with fiery orange leaves curling along the sidewalks. The sharp mountain air bit at my lungs, but cleared the fog from my mind. I passed a dusty coffee shop, a second-hand clothing store, and then a narrow storefront with tall windows lined with books. Its hand-painted sign read the pine needle. Something about it stopped me cold. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, a brass bell chiming softly above me. The smell hit instantly. Old paper, worn leather, dried flowers, and time itself. My heart squeezed unexpectedly. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed that scent. Behind the counter sat an elderly man with white hair and large round glasses, squinting down at a crossword puzzle. "Cold out there," he commented without looking up. I nodded faintly. "Just browsing." The man studied me for a second longer than necessary, then stood abruptly. "You're Sienna, aren't you?" he asked. My blood froze. "I think you've mistaken me for someone else," I whispered, instinctively stepping back toward the door. But he was already walking toward a back room. "Your father left something here for you. Said to give it to you if you ever came through." I stopped cold. No, it couldn't be. My feet stayed planted, yet my heart sprinted wildly inside my chest. The man returned carrying a battered package, the brown paper soft and fragile, tied with frayed twine. Across the front, written in slanted black ink I had never seen in person, "For Sienna, for when you're ready." My hands shook uncontrollably as I untied the package right there in front of the register. A journal, thick, leather-bound, its surface cracked and soft with age. I lowered myself slowly onto a nearby bench, barely breathing. The first page was a letter. "Sienna, if you're reading this, it means you found your way back to yourself. They took so much from me. I tried to fight. I tried to reach you. I hope this is how I finally do." My vision blurred instantly. I flipped through the pages, tears spilling freely onto the ink. There were dozens of entries, birthday wishes, rambling thoughts, poems, tiny, careful sketches of a willow tree I remembered loving as a child. Letters to me, from my father, a man I barely remembered, but who had never stopped searching for me. Court documents were tucked between the pages, records of blocked calls, voicemails left and never returned. One entry read, "She's being hidden from me. Her mother says she's not ready. I know that's not true. Sienna deserves more than silence." I pressed the journal to my chest, curling around it as if it could protect me from everything. The hours slipped by unnoticed. The elderly clerk never interrupted. He just let me sit, let me breathe, let me grieve. For the first time in years, I felt seen. Not as someone else's burden, not as someone else's scapegoat, but simply as me. When I finally stood to leave, the journal still tight in my arms, I felt different. I was still bruised, still angry, still broken in places, but I wasn't invisible anymore. There was something sacred about knowing I had been loved by someone who never got the chance to say it out loud. Someone who tried, even when no one believed him, even when my mother had made him disappear from my life. I walked back into the cold October sunlight with the journal pressed close to my ribs like a secret. Across the street, through the glass window of a small art supply store, I saw canvases stacked neatly against the far wall. My stomach tightened, but not from fear. For the first time in years, I knew what I needed to do next. 2 weeks later, I stepped off a regional train just outside Boulder, Colorado, wearing a mismatched thrift store coat, a scarf that didn't belong to me, and a name no one had ever called me before. I rented a tiny studio apartment on the outskirts of town with what little money I had saved from working part-time at a local print shop. I barely spoke to anyone. I wasn't ready to explain who I was. At night, I painted. By day, I floated through the town unnoticed, past the bright murals splashed across brick walls, the smell of roasted coffee drifting from corner cafes, the sound of students laughing at bus stops. But every night, I returned to that small studio and painted my pain. Canvas after canvas, sketches first, then full colors, bold strokes layered over broken outlines. I painted the memories I couldn't say out loud. I painted the years they had tried to erase me. And then one night I painted her, the girl behind glass, a single figure standing alone in a darkened room, her hands pressed flat against invisible walls, her mouth open in a silent scream no one could hear. I called the piece the Forgotten Room. It was raw, ugly in places, messy and imperfect, just like me. I didn't create it for anyone else. I didn't expect to sell it. I submitted it under the anonymous name MKH49 to an open call for emerging artists at a small community gallery. Weeks passed. I didn't hear back. Then the rejection email came. Too dark, too heavy, not the right fit. I stared at the screen in stunned silence, my hands cold and still over the keyboard. For a long time I sat there, motionless, numb. Then something unexpected happened. I got an email from someone at the gallery, a woman named Elena, one of the curators. She told me she had come across my piece tucked in the rejected submissions. She said she had grown up in a home just like mine. She said she had followed my blog quietly for years. I know what you're saying with this, she wrote. Please let me put it in the showcase. I read her message over and over again, the screen blurring as tears welled. I whispered into the stillness, yes. Opening night arrived cold and clear. I stood at the back of the gallery, hidden behind a pillar covered in event flyers, my arms crossed tightly against my ribs. My hair was longer now. My walk had lost the limp. No one gave me a second glance, not until they walked in. I froze as my mother, flawless in an ivory shawl, swept into the gallery, her heels clicking sharply across the polished concrete floor. Aubrey followed close behind, heels too high for someone trying so hard to look casual. They moved from piece to piece, laughing softly at abstract splashes, whispering judgments under their breath like they always had. And then they stopped in front of my painting. Aubrey tilted her head, curiously. Weird, she murmured. This feels familiar somehow. My mother chuckled. These sad little artists think silence is a personality trait. The words punched through me harder than any blow. It was the same cadence she had used the night she pulled me out of that car. That cold, cutting dismissal. But this time, I didn't flinch. The gallery, a host stepped up to the microphone, clearing his throat as the crowd hushed. Thank you for joining us at this year's Emerging Voices Showcase, he began warmly. Tonight, we reveal the names of the anonymous artists behind each work. My fingers tightened around the crumpled tissue in my hand. Name after name echoed through the space, applause filling the gaps. Then the host stopped in front of mine. And this, he said, gesturing toward the painting of the girl behind glass, is The Forgotten Room by Sienna Harper. Silence. A heavy, suffocating pause settled over the room. I heard the sharp clink of glass against tile. Aubrey's wine stem rolled across the floor and came to rest against the baseboard. My mother's mouth fell open. Soundless, I stepped out from behind the pillar, calm, unapologetic. I didn't smile. I didn't speak. I simply met their stunned, disbelieving gazes and held them. You told me no one would ever hear my story. I thought. They had stared at my painting for 20 full minutes, and not one of them had been able to look away. The murmurs swept through the room like ripples across still water. I felt every pair of eyes shift toward me, some with confusion, others with dawning recognition. Aubrey stared at me, her expression shifting rapidly from shock to disbelief to something I had never seen before, pleading. My mother's cheeks flushed deep crimson, not with shame, but with rage. Rage that I had broken the script. Rage that I had spoken without her permission. But I didn't stay for her response. I turned slowly, my boots tapping softly against the polished concrete, and walked toward the gallery doors. Each step felt weightless. Snow had started falling outside. Heavy, slow flakes drifted down and clung to my coat. I stepped into the cold without hesitation. For the first time in years, I wasn't hiding. I wasn't running. I had stood still, spoken truth, left a mark. Some stories don't need to scream. They just need to be seen. I made my way back to my small studio, slipped off my coat, and collapsed into the worn chair by the window. I thought it was over. I had said what I needed to say. I expected nothing more. But the world doesn't always wait for permission. The first email came at 7:14 a.m. the next morning. Subject line: "Thank you for painting what I couldn't say." Then another, and another. A therapist in San Diego asked if she could feature my work at a trauma survivor fundraiser. A legal advocate from Portland offered pro bono counsel if I ever needed it. Students, mothers, teachers, strangers from all over the country sent me messages. "Are you the Sienna?" I didn't reply. Not yet. I just stared at the flood of words filling my inbox. Then the video surfaced. Someone at the gallery had filmed the reveal. The clip barely lasted a minute. My painting, my name, the silence, the shattered wine glass. It hit 1.8 million views within 48 hours. The comments rolled in by the thousands. "She didn't paint this, she bled it." Her mom just stood there and laughed. Disgusting. This is why we believe the quiet ones. I scrolled for hours, stunned. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just stared at the impossible wave of people who had heard me. Then my inbox shifted again. A journalist from the Rocky Mountain Gazette. My old high school counselor. My former art teacher. But the email that froze me came from someone unexpected. "You should know, Child Protective Services has reopened a file. You may be contacted." Attached was a grainy scanned photo from over a decade earlier. Me at 12, standing rigid at the edge of a school hallway, arms crossed over my chest. I remembered the day. My mother had accused me of skipping class. I hadn't. I had been waiting for the school nurse to clear me after an asthma attack. Apparently, someone had been watching even then. I sat motionless, breath shallow, hands trembling. Then, as if on autopilot, I dug into the back of my drawer and pulled out an ancient, cracked iPod I had duct-taped back together years ago. I charged it for hours. When it finally powered on, I scrolled through the voice memos, heart racing. There it was. April 14th, porch. I hit play. The recording crackled to life. My mother's voice, raw, unfiltered. "You're not mine anymore. You're just, wait, you think you matter? No one ever cared." I stared at the dark screen, shaking. I had recorded it, by accident, probably while trying to capture a song. I posted the file. No caption, no tags, just the date burned into blackness. By nightfall, my inbox exploded. And then the knock came. I froze in place, heart thudding. I had expected Natalie, maybe even Aubrey, face flushed with rage. Instead, a tall man with wire-rimmed glasses and a press badge stood at my door. "Seattle Ledger," he said softly. "May I ask about the Forgotten Room?" I opened the door a fraction wider and nodded. The next day, my phone rang. I stared at the screen for a long time before answering. Aubrey's voice crackled through the line, sharp and brittle as ever. "You had no right, Sienna," she hissed. "No one knows what Mom was going through. You don't get to do this to us." I closed my eyes, exhaustion washing over me. My grip on the phone tightened, just slightly. "She was going through me," I whispered and hung up. That night, the gallery's social media account posted a single image, my painting hanging under a soft pool of gallery light. The caption read, "We stand with survivors. The Forgotten Room will now hang permanently in our Boulder South branch." I didn't share it. I didn't repost. I didn't need to. I stood by the window of my tiny studio, watching the last traces of winter melt from the rooftops. The sky above the mountains had shifted from heavy gray to a pale, tender blue. For the first time in years, my chest felt light, free. The cold that had lived like stone inside me for so long had moved. It was theirs now. My mother, Aubrey, everyone who had used my silence to comfort themselves. They had lost control of the narrative. They could no longer rewrite my ending. And then another knock came. I hesitated this time, my hand lingering on the worn doorknob. When I opened it, I found a girl, maybe 15, thin, nervous, with pale skin and a tightly wound ponytail. She stared up at me, terrified but determined. I saw your painting, she whispered. Her voice cracked slightly. My mom, she says things like that too. I didn't ask for her name. I didn't need details. I simply stepped aside and held the door open wider, letting her step into the light. The next morning, I stood in a modest community center on the edge of Flagstaff, Arizona, hands dusted in clay, sleeves rolled to my elbows. The small room smelled of fresh paint and old wood. 15 children sat around me, some with wide, cautious eyes, others with heads bowed, refusing to make eye contact. One girl, no older than 7, silently drew a crooked little house with a jagged line cutting through it. I knelt beside her, voice soft. Is this where you live? She nodded once, barely perceptible. That's me, she said, hiding behind the fridge. The breath caught painfully in my throat. I didn't cry. I couldn't. I simply handed her a second brush. What would it look like if you came out? The child stared at the empty corner of the page. For a long time she didn't move. Then she dipped her brush into a bright yellow. The smallest, clumsiest sun appeared over the tiny, broken house. I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded gently. That's perfect. Later that night, I walked out of the center as dusk draped the streets in lavender shadows. My phone buzzed softly in my pocket. A message. Subject, you made it. It was from my old social worker back in Seattle. I just saw the Ledger article. I always knew you'd rise. Thank you for never letting them define you. I didn't respond. I slipped the phone back into my jacket and looked up at the darkening sky. The cold mountain air filled my lungs sharp and clean. For the first time, I breathed deeply, without flinching, without shrinking, without needing anyone's permission. I whispered to myself into the wind, smiling faintly for no one but me. Some people spend their lives trying to silence the ones they should have loved the loudest. But healing doesn't always begin with an apology. It begins the moment you stop waiting for one.